The last thing Jackson Pierce expected when he rented the secluded beach house was to be caught in a hurricane of tangled fishing nets and a fiery, tempered neighbor. But there he was, standing ankle-deep in the sand, watching as a woman wrestled with a pile of tangled ropes on the dock, cursing under her breath. She hadn't even noticed him yet. Jackson had only arrived an hour ago, his black SUV kicking up dust as he pulled into the private driveway of the modern, glass-fronted getaway he'd rented for the next 3 months. He needed a break time away from the boardrooms, the investors, the relentless grind of running a multi-million-dollar empire. The ocean was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it had brought her. "Need help?" he called, stepping onto the wooden dock. The woman looked up, strands of wavy brown hair whipping across her sun-kissed face. She had striking green eyes, sharp with suspicion. "I can handle it." Her voice was clipped, but Jackson crouched down anyway, reaching for the mess of nets. "I said," but before she could finish her protest, the net gave way suddenly, sending her stumbling forward straight into his chest. For a second, neither of them moved. Her hands were pressed against his chest, and he could feel the warmth of her skin through his linen shirt. She smelled like the sea, salt, and sunshine, and something faintly floral. She pulled back quickly, clearing her throat. "Thanks," she muttered, brushing her hands on her shorts, "but I really had it." Jackson smirked. "Sure you did." Her eyes narrowed. "You're the guy who rented the house next door, aren't you?" "Guilty." She let out a breath, glancing at the sleek modern home beside her much smaller, much older beach cottage. "Figures?" Jackson raised a brow. "Something wrong with that?" "Not unless you're planning on throwing wild parties or acting like you own the whole beach," he chuckled, folding his arms. "Not my style." She studied him for a moment as if deciding whether or not to believe him. Then, with a sigh, she extended a hand. "Mia Harper." Her handshake was firm, confident. Jackson liked that. Jackson Pierce. Her brows lifted slightly. Pierce, as in Pierce Tech, so she recognized his name. He was used to it by now, people either fawning over his success or assuming he was just another spoiled rich guy. He waited for her reaction. Mia simply nodded. "Huh, that was it." No gushing, no judgment, just acceptance. "Interesting." "Well," she said, stepping back, "welcome to Seabrook Cove. Just don't ruin the quiet, and we'll be fine." With that, she turned, hoisting the now detangled net over her shoulder and heading toward a small fishing boat docked nearby. Jackson watched her go, a slow grin spreading across his face. Maybe this place wouldn't be so boring after all. Over the next few days, Jackson settled into the slow rhythm of beach life. Mornings were spent jogging along the shore, afternoons working remotely from his deck overlooking the water, and evenings sipping whiskey as the sun dipped below the horizon. And then there was Mia. She was always around fixing something on her boat, carrying crates of supplies, chatting with the locals at the tiny beachside cafe. She wasn't the kind of woman who sat still for long, and Jackson found himself watching her more than he cared to admit. One evening, he spotted her struggling to load a heavy cooler onto her boat. Without thinking, he walked over. "Need help," she sighed, hands on her hips. "You really don't have to keep rescuing me." "Who said anything about rescuing?" He lifted the cooler easily, placing it onto the boat. "Maybe I just like showing off my strength." Mia rolled her eyes but smirked. "Great, a millionaire with an ego." Jackson leaned against the railing. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She crossed her arms. "Guys like you don't usually stick around small towns like this." "Maybe I'm different." She gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, twisting off the cap. "So why are you here, really? You don't seem like the relaxing beach vacation type." Jackson hesitated. "Most people wouldn't understand." "I needed a break," he admitted. "Too many people want something from me, too many expectations." Out here, no one cares about my last big deal or how much money's in my bank account. Mia studied him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah. I get that. Something about the way she said it made Jackson curious. You running from something too? She took a sip of water, eyes fixed on the horizon. Not running, just choosing my own path. He wanted to ask more, but she changed the subject quickly. You ever been on a fishing boat before? Jackson smirked. Do yachts count? Mia laughed, the sound warm and unexpected. Not even close. He liked the way she laughed. He liked the way she didn't treat him any differently just because of his wealth. And without meaning to, Jackson realized something. He liked her. A week later, Jackson found himself standing on Mia's boat, regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. You look ridiculous, Mia said, trying and failing to hold back laughter. Jackson scowled, adjusting the bright orange life vest she'd insisted he wear. This thing is choking me. Would you rather drown? I'd rather not look like a traffic cone, Mia grinned, tossing him a fishing rod. Relax, city boy. You'll survive. Jackson wasn't so sure, but as the boat rocked gently on the waves and Mia showed him how to cast his line, he found himself enjoying the simplicity of it. The quiet. The lack of expectations, and the company. Mia was different from anyone he'd ever met. She was independent, sharp-witted, and completely unimpressed by his money. That night, as they sat on the deck of her boat, watching the stars reflect on the dark water, Jackson realized something else. He hadn't just rented a beach house. He'd found something he never expected. And he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. Jackson had never been one for idle hands. Even on vacation, his mind instinctively searched for the next challenge, something to conquer. But Seabrook Cove was pushing him to slow down in ways he hadn't expected, mostly because of Mia. Days passed in the easy rhythm of salt air and sun-drenched afternoons, and somehow, Jackson found himself drawn into her world more than he intended. He told himself it was just curiosity. She was unlike any woman he'd ever met. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. One evening, he spotted her hauling wooden crates from the dock to a small open-air seafood shack perched near the beach. The place was rustic, with string lights swaying in the breeze and the scent of grilled fish wafting through the air. Jackson leaned against a nearby post, watching as she moved effortlessly through the task. She was strong, determined, and completely in her element. You planning to just stand there, or are you going to make yourself useful? Mia called over her shoulder. Without a word, he strode forward and lifted one of the heavier crates onto his shoulder. She raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you liked getting your hands dirty. Only when it's worth it. Mia shook her head, muttering something under her breath, but he caught the hint of a smile. They worked in silence for a while, stacking crates, unloading supplies, and preparing the shack for the evening crowd. By the time they finished, the sky had turned a dusky shade of violet, and the first few customers had begun to trickle in. Mia wiped her hands on a towel and nodded toward an empty stool at the counter. You sticking around? Jackson hesitated. He had planned on heading back to his place, maybe pouring himself a drink and watching the ocean in solitude, but the idea of leaving didn't sit right. Yeah, he said, taking the seat. Why not? A middle-aged man behind the counter, wearing an apron dusted with flour, grinned. Well, look who's making friends. Mia, you finally letting outsiders in. Mia rolled her eyes. Jackson, this is Gus. He owns the place. Gus extended a flour-dusted hand. Welcome to the best seafood shack in town. Jackson shook his hand, amused by the man's enthusiasm. High praise. I assume you back it up, Gus laughed. You tell me after you've eaten. A few minutes later, Jackson was staring at a plate of grilled snapper, buttery corn on the cob, and something Mia called the best coleslaw on the East Coast. He took a bite, and his brows lifted. Okay, I stand corrected, Mia smirked. Told you. As the evening wore on, Jackson found himself immersed in the easy flow of conversation. Locals came and went, greeting Mia like an old friend, exchanging stories about the day's fishing hauls and upcoming town events. Jackson had never been part of a community like this. His world had always been about high stakes, fast decisions, and constant motion. Here, everything felt different, grounded, real, and Mia was at the center of it all. At some point she caught him watching her. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. Jackson shook his head. "Nothing, just thinking that you fit here." Mia glanced around the shack, then shrugged. "It's home." He leaned forward slightly. "And you wouldn't trade it for anything?" Something flickered across her expression, something unreadable. "I've had offers," she said carefully. "Developers want to buy up this stretch of land, turn it into luxury resorts." Jackson could already picture it. A string of high-end properties, private beaches, exclusive clubs. It was exactly the kind of investment his world thrived on, but the thought of it replacing this, it didn't sit right. "And," he prompted. Mia exhaled. "And I said no." Jackson studied her. "Most people would take the money." "I'm not most people." No, she definitely wasn't. As the night wound down, Jackson found himself lingering. When the last of the customers left, Mia locked up, stretching her arms above her head. "You should go," she said, stifling a yawn. "You've had your adventure for the night." Jackson smirked. "You call this an adventure? For a guy like you," she smirked back. "Absolutely." He didn't argue. Instead, he walked her down the dock toward where her boat was moored. The breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of salt and something faintly floral. Mia's shampoo, maybe. She hesitated at the edge of the dock. "Thanks for helping tonight," she said. Jackson nodded. "Thanks for letting me." A moment of silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then Mia turned and stepped onto her boat. Jackson watched until she disappeared below deck, then exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had come here to escape, but now he wasn't sure he wanted to leave at all. Jackson wasn't used to staying in one place for long. His life had always been about movement, boardrooms, business trips, high-pressure deals that never allowed for hesitation. But Seabrook Cove had a way of slowing things down, making him see life through a different lens. And Mia Harper was at the center of it. She had a way of pulling him into her world without even trying. One day, he'd planned to spend the afternoon reviewing emails, but Mia had other ideas. He found himself in her truck, bouncing over uneven back roads as she took him to the local farmer's market, laughing when he balked at the idea of picking out fresh seafood himself. Another afternoon, he was knee-deep in water, helping her repair the dock after a passing storm loosened several planks. She never asked for his help, but somehow he couldn't stay away. And then there were the nights. Jackson had never been one for small town gatherings, but whenever Mia was around, he found himself staying longer than he planned. Whether it was a bonfire on the beach, a late-night boat ride, or just sitting outside the shack after hours, talking until the stars filled the sky, he never wanted the moments to end. But the more time he spent with her, the sharper the reality of his life pressed against him. One evening, after another long day spent tangled in her world, Jackson leaned against the railing of her boat, watching the water shift under the moonlight. Mia sat beside him, her legs stretched out, the night air cool against their skin. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Jackson exhaled. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at him. "You're not staying here forever." He knew that. He had a company to run, a life that stretched far beyond this quiet little town. But the thought of leaving, he didn't want to finish that thought. Mia must have noticed his silence because she let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I've seen it before, you know. People come here looking for an escape. They fall in love with the simplicity, with the quiet, but then reality calls them back." Jackson turned to her, the words settling between them like an unspoken truth. She was preparing for him to leave, expecting it, and maybe she was right. But the idea of walking away from her twisted something deep inside him. Instead of answering, he reached for her hand. He didn't pull her close, didn't try to convince her of something he wasn't sure of yet. He just held it, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. Mia didn't pull away. They sat there, hands intertwined, as the waves lapped softly against the boat. Neither of them spoke, but the silence held more weight than words ever could. Jackson wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to figure it out. Jackson had never known stillness like this before. The world he came from was one of constant motion, relentless ambition, and carefully calculated risks. But here, with Mia beside him, the waves lapping gently against the dock and the salty night air pressing against his skin, it felt like time had slowed to something more real, more tangible. He didn't want to leave, and yet reality had a way of creeping in where it wasn't wanted. The next morning, his phone buzzed incessantly from where he had tossed it on the kitchen counter of his rented beach house. For days, he had ignored the growing pile of unanswered emails, the mounting calls from the board, the urgent messages demanding his presence back in the city. But this call was different. The name flashing across the screen was his father's. Jackson exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before finally answering. His father's voice was brisk, efficient. There was an important deal on the table, one that required Jackson's signature. Investors were waiting. Time was running out. Jackson leaned against the counter, glancing out the wide glass doors to where the ocean stretched endlessly before him. The life he had built was calling him back. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. Mia was waiting for him at the dock when he arrived later that afternoon. She had been out on the water all morning, and the sun had left a golden glow on her skin, her hair wind-tousled and free. The sight of her sent something deep and certain through him, something that made the rest of the world feel insignificant. She smiled when she saw him, but it faltered slightly as she took in his expression. He didn't have to say anything. She already knew. Mia turned back to her boat, adjusting a coiled rope. Her movements were precise, focused, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. He stepped closer. When she finally turned to face him, there was no anger, no accusation. Just quiet understanding and something else, something that made his chest tighten. She had always known this moment would come. Jackson reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She squeezed gently, as if memorizing the feel of him. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything unspoken. Then, without another word, Mia pulled him onto the boat, guiding him to the bench where they had sat so many nights before. The sky was streaked with the soft hues of sunset, casting a golden glow over the water. She rested her head against his shoulder, her breath steady. Jackson closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of the sea of her. Neither of them spoke of goodbyes. That night when he kissed her, it wasn't with hesitation or regret. It was with the certainty that no amount of time or distance could change what was between them. But when the morning came, Jackson knew he had to go. Mia stood at the dock as he packed his bags into the back of his car. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't need to. Because as he drove away, his heart stayed behind. Weeks passed. The city swallowed him whole once more. Board meetings, negotiations, late nights spent in high-rise offices where the air smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. But nothing felt the same. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ocean. He saw Mia. He had built a life around control, around knowing exactly what came next. But now nothing felt certain except for her. Jackson had never been one for impulsive decisions. But love had a way of changing a man. The jet touched down just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the familiar scent of salt and sea air rushing to greet him the moment he stepped outside. He didn't hesitate. His car tore down the winding roads of Seabrook Cove, past the familiar landmarks, past the life he had left behind. And then he saw her. Mia stood at the dock, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Her eyes widened as he stepped out of the car, her expression unreadable. Jackson didn't waste a second. He closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his hands, his thumb brushing against her cheek. She searched his gaze, as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, just as he opened his mouth, she whispered his name, and he knew. He had made the right choice, because no matter where he went, no matter how far he strayed, this was where he belonged. With her, forever, Jackson had never driven so fast in his life. The winding road leading to Seabrook Cove blurred past him, the ocean coming into view as the sun cast deep amber streaks across the sky. His heart pounded, not from the speed, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Mia stood at the dock, her hair tousled by the breeze, her arms crossed as she watched him approach. There was something unreadable in her expression, something cautious, as if she wasn't sure he was real. He didn't give her time to question it. The second he reached her, Jackson pulled her close, his hands firm on her waist. He felt the hesitation in her body, the way her breath caught against his chest, but she didn't pull away. Not this time. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with the unspoken words neither had been ready to say before. Jackson tightened his grip, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. He told her everything. How the city had felt hollow without her. How every meeting, every deal, every carefully structured plan had felt meaningless in comparison to what he had left behind. How he had spent his entire life chasing success, believing that was all he needed until he met her. Mia's fingers curled slightly against his shirt, her body tensed as she listened. Then, just as he finished, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. She wasn't angry. She wasn't indifferent. But there was something else in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't going to make this easy for him. And Jackson didn't want easy. He wanted her. Mia took a careful step back, her gaze searching his, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. She asked him what he was really doing here, not just in Seabrook Cove. Not just standing in front of her. What was he truly willing to give up? Jackson didn't hesitate. Because for the first time in his life, he had absolute clarity. He wasn't giving anything up. He was choosing something better. Mia's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. As if she had spent weeks convincing herself that he would never say it. And then, before she could say anything else, Jackson reached into his pocket. The ring wasn't extravagant, not the kind of thing a man of his wealth would normally present. It wasn't about grandeur or status, it was about her. A simple band, delicate yet unbreakable, like them. Mia's eyes widened as he held it up, the last of the sunlight catching the metal. Jackson told her he wasn't asking her to leave Seabrook Cove. He wasn't asking her to change. He was asking her to let him be part of her world the same way she had become part of his. Mia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the ring, her fingers tracing the cool metal before she looked up at him. Jackson waited, his pulse steady, knowing that whatever happened next, he had already made his choice. Then, slowly, Mia smiled. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. It wasn't filled with tears or gasping declarations. It was simple. It was real. And when she slipped the ring onto her finger, Jackson knew he had found his forever. Jackson never thought a single moment could alter the course of his entire life. But standing there, watching Mia slip the ring onto her finger, he knew nothing would ever be the same. The weight of his decision settled into his chest not as a burden but as a certainty. He had made his choice. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't about business, power, or success. It was about love. It was about her. Mia's fingers brushed against his as she examined the ring, her eyes searching his face as if she still couldn't quite believe he was here, that this was real. He could see the hesitation warring with hope in her expression, but he wasn't going to let doubt win. Not this time. The sound of the waves filled the silence between them, the cool ocean breeze ruffling her hair as they stood on the dock. Jackson had always been confident in negotiations, in high-stakes decisions, but this waiting for Mia's response, waiting for her to fully accept what he was offering, this was the most nerve-wracking moment of his life. Mia exhaled a slow, measured breath as she tilted her head, studying him. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. Then, finally, she spoke. She told him she had spent weeks convincing herself that he wouldn't come back, that men like him didn't stay. That she had tried to prepare for the moment he would walk away for good, because it was easier than hoping for something that seemed impossible. Jackson's jaw tightened, guilt threading through him, but she held up a hand before he could say anything. She told him that despite everything, despite her fears, despite the logic that had told her not to believe in fairy tales, she had wanted him to come back. She had wanted him to fight for her, for them, and now here he was. A flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but she wasn't done. She asked him what this meant for his life in the city, for the company, the empire he had built. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't a factor. Jackson didn't hesitate. He told her that his life had always been about control, about making decisions that benefited the bigger picture. But for the first time, he was making a decision for himself. That he wasn't giving up his company, he had built it from the ground up. And it was still important, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered anymore. Mia frowned slightly, as if trying to fit the pieces together. Jackson explained that he had already put things in motion, delegating responsibilities, restructuring his leadership team so he wouldn't have to be tethered to the city the way he once was. That he could work remotely when needed, that he could make this work. Because he wanted this, wanted her. Mia's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face before something softer, something deeper, took hold. Her fingers tightened around his. She asked if he was sure. Jackson smirked, shaking his head slightly before answering. He told her that for a man who spent his entire life making calculated choices, this was the easiest decision he had ever made. Mia let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head as if she still couldn't believe it. Then, before he could say another word, she surged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him. Jackson's arms banded around her waist, holding her close as he buried his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of sea salt and something uniquely Mia. The relief, the joy, the overwhelming certainty of it all crashed over him like a wave. She wasn't letting go, and neither was he. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjusting, of finding their rhythm in this new reality. Jackson stayed, not just as a visitor, not just as an escape, but as a man who had chosen to build something real here. Mia took him out on the boat again, but this time, it wasn't just another lesson in fishing or another moment of teasing him about his city boy ways. This time, it was different. She showed him the little hidden coves along the coastline, the places she had loved since childhood. She told him stories she had never shared before about her parents, about the way the town had shaped her, about the dreams she had kept tucked away for years. And Jackson listened. He memorized every word, every detail, because this wasn't just about staying, it was about understanding, about being part of her world in a way that wasn't temporary. One evening, as they sat on the deck of her boat, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Mia turned to him, her expression serious. She told him that she never thought she'd find someone who would understand her life here, who would want to be part of it without trying to change it. Jackson reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. He told her that for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to change anything. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Mia smiled, leaning into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The quiet stretched between them, not heavy with uncertainty, but light with the kind of peace that came from knowing they had made the right choice. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, as the waves rocked gently beneath them, Jackson knew this wasn't just a new chapter. This was home. Forever.